Hi guys, I'm Randy with BRStv, and we're on our third and final tank here at WWC. If you haven't seen the 900 and 500, go check those out because this one will build on those two. Today we're talking about this 293-gallon mixed reef with sand, which might be the most important of the three, as it's very similar to the same tanks that you keep at home. So we're going to jump right into this tank, and I've got Josh here with me again. Josh, how old is this tank?
This tank is about 6 years old now. It's approximately 39 inches from front to back and 60 inches long. And it's been Casper's home since he came with us.
So we're starting to notice a theme here that you guys like these 30-inch tall tanks and pretty deep from front to back.
That's correct. We try to keep the tanks about 30 inches tall because 24 is a little too shallow to deliver the flow properly. And the depth on the tank allows us for more of an artistic rock structure.
So you guys already had this 500-gallon in the storefront. Why that addition of the 293?
Well, Victor has a thing for euphilia, and we already have a tank with no sand, so we decided on this one to go with a little bit more of an LPS approach, where we can put lower flow, a little bit lower light, and appeal to some of those corals that wouldn't do so well in our higher flow tank.
So like the other two tanks, I'm guessing that the fish in here also serve a purpose.
They do. Again, utilitarian, as we said before, the Tang gang. So they're there to eat algae, and primarily to get along with Casper. So we chose our fish around him, basically. So we've had Casper for about 6 years now. He's leucistic, so there has been times where he's gone a little bit yellow, kind of look like a pyramid butterfly, and back to white like you see him now. And he's kind of our pride and joy around here. So the fish that we put in here, we were sure they would get along well, and we haven't had any new additions since. His health is a priority of ours, being he's the only one in captivity that we're aware of.
So for cleanup crew on this tank, it seems that there's little to none.
Yeah, there's really not a lot of rock space in the tank, so the snails have a hard time holding on to something and not ending up upside down in the sand bed.
So let's talk again about the first element of reef tank biology, starting with chemistry. This tank is probably like the other ones where we're at 480 calcium, 1440 magnesium, and 8.6 alkalinity.
Yeah, that covers pretty much everything here at the shop.
So we've got temperature at 78 degrees, and trace elements is handled by the water changes with the Brightwell Neomarine.
Yeah, that's correct. So we're going to do the same 10 to 15% water change as we would on the rest of our systems.
So as far as pH, is this like the other tanks?
It is. It runs at about 7-9. If we're lucky, we get to maybe 8. The room tends to have a good amount of people in it, so there is a fair share of carbon dioxide. Not to mention we do run a calcium reactor, so it may have a slight effect on the pH.
So on the 500-gallon, you guys have an auto top-off. What are you guys using on this tank?
We actually use the same feed barrel. We use saturated kalkwasser to deliver that high pH that we look for in the 500-gallon tank.
And what do you find the benefits from that higher pH?
A more robust coral that will lay down a skeletal base faster than coral that's not in a high pH environment.
So cycling this tank was another 4-month process?
Actually, no. The cycle is more around 2 months, like the 500, because of the fact that it is in our front retail space. We kind of pushed a little bit shorter than we should have, and we would have preferred for it to have been longer.
So let's move on to that second component of reef tank biology with filtration. Do you guys have a skimmer on this tank?
We do not.
Is there a reason why you decided not to go with a skimmer?
Yeah, we had a skimmer at one point in time, but it seemed a little bit too much. The tank was over-skimmed, and some of the larger single polyp corals didn't appreciate that. They got kind of skinny and lost a little bit of color, so we took it offline. At some point in time, if we ever feel the need to put a skimmer back, we may, but it's doing well just the way that it is.
So on this one, is it filter socks or filter pads?
This is a filter sock. The sump has an integrated hole for a sock. It would probably be better to have the entire shop converted over to filter pad at some point, but for now we use socks.
So that's 3 systems with filter pads or filter socks. What's the primary use for you guys with these?
We feel it takes out a lot of particulate. Being we do feed a lot, that's pretty important. It helps us export some of that excess nutrient. It also benefits the tank's clarity, because then you don't have all that stuff floating around in the water column that you can see when the bright lights are on.
So the biological filtration for the other 2 tanks was rock only. The biological filtration on this tank includes rock and the sand?
Yeah, it's not dissimilar. The rock is really mature rock that we've had for years, which is always going to be a plus for us, on top of the fact that we do have the sand bed for that added nutrient that we're looking for.
Is there anything you don't like about the sand?
It's a lot more labor intensive. This tank is probably the most difficult to keep in show condition on a regular basis. In addition to the amount of work that it takes to keep the sand bed clean, we can only deliver less than half of the flow we would in our other tanks as well, being the fact that they are bare bottom and this one has sand.
So Josh, that brings us to another component of filtration with flow. What are you guys using for flow on this tank?
On this tank we have 4 Ecotech MP40s. On the back side of the tank, because the rock structure is a little bit higher, they're turned down more. And in the front, where it's more open, they do have a little bit more intensity, but we still have to keep it low to keep that sand in place. So this is a good time to point out that because we do have a higher nutrient system with lower flow, some of the acropora specifically don't color up as well as they would in some of our other systems. However, we are trying to cater to every coral in this tank from either upper reef slopes or lower spots. Some of these corals come from 80 feet, and we're trying to keep it in a box that's only 30 inches tall.
You make a good point that these mixed reef tanks could probably be some of the hardest to keep, unlike species-specific SPS tanks, because we're trying to keep such a diverse group of corals that wouldn't naturally occur that way in the wild.
I would definitely agree with that. Mixed reef tanks are probably the most common within the hobbyist home, but they are definitely the hardest to take care of due to the wide variety of corals we keep. Because of the middle ground parameters that we keep on this tank and the wide variety of corals that we keep here, I would expect that any of the new corals that we truly cherish could go into this tank and guarantee its survival.
Getting to that last component of flow with the return pump, what are you guys using on this tank?
On this tank, it's a Mag 9.5.
So I noticed that there's no DC powered pumps on any of your guys' system. Is there a reason behind that?
We have a lot of AC pumps around the shop. Because they are plug and play and they do last a long time, DC pumps offer that really quiet controllability factor. Here, that's really not an obstacle. We don't need it to be quieter in here.
On the other 2 tanks, you guys run carbon. Same on this one?
Yeah, very similar to the 500 because it's in the display room. There's actually 3 panes of viewing, so when you look straight through it, if there is a tinge of green, we kind of want that to go.
Yeah. How do you guys run that carbon?
In a carbon reactor.
All right, Josh, we're on that third element of reef tank biology with lighting. What do you guys run on this tank?
On this tank, we have 6 XR15 Gen 4 Pros. Previously, around 6 months ago, we switched from XR30s to deliver a better spread from front to back because we did have a little bit of dark in the front and on the back side of the tank. We also added the diffuser to help blend some of that light. With the sand bed, you do pick up on a lot of those bands of red and green, and with the diffuser, you don't see that anymore. With the diffuser, we get more of a smooth shimmer rather than the flicker that you would get without the diffuser, and it gives more of that T5 appeal, if you know what I'm saying.
And unlike the other tank, this one has no T5s.
We opted to stay away from T5 for the simple fact that it doesn't look good with an open top tank.
Have you guys ever considered something like the Aquatic Life hybrid fixture?
We've kicked around the idea of adding T5s to it, but it just never really came to because it's doing well the way that it is, and we felt it was necessary to just leave it. If somebody dropped off an extra row of XR15s for free, I would probably say I would go up onto the tank to solve that light distribution problem.
So elaborate a little bit more about the spacing and the mounting height on these XR15s.
So very similar to the other tanks, they're mounted quite high off the water. I think these ones might be a little bit closer at like 20 inches. And we do space them a little bit more than a foot apart. But it was a vast improvement over the 3 XR30s that we had on there before this.
So you're saying that extra mounting height solves some of that distribution problem?
Yeah, I think honestly the biggest key there is that we're given an even or a more even distribution of intensity.
Speaking of intensity, on those other tanks, we were ranging from around 80 par to 350 or above par. On this one, what is your guys' intensity and spectrum?
So the spectrum is the same. We use the same schedule on all of our display tanks, and we do modify the intensity accordingly. The intensity on this tank is lower because, like we said before, we're trying to cater to a more wide variety of coral rather than just making sure our acropora is growing well and colored up properly.
So we're on that last element of reef tank biology with nutrients. Nitrates and phosphate in this tank, is it similar to the other ones?
It's close. We actually keep the nitrate a little bit lower in this tank, more intentionally to keep the sand bed cleaner.
So you're saying because of the sand, you have to intentionally keep nitrates down?
Yeah, we find that with a little bit of a lower level nitrate, we prevent the same algae from growing on the sand that you get on your glass. To add to that, the sand bed, when it's clean, really sets this tank off. So we do our best to try to make sure it stays pearly white.
So all the nutrients in this tank come from your WWC food?
Yeah, we feed this tank every hour on the hour, just like all of our other tanks do. The more we do things similar from one tank to the next, the fewer variables we have, and we try to keep it really simple, and that's part of the process.
So Josh, maintenance is one of the last components, and you already mentioned the 10 to 15% water changes on this tank, as well as cleaning the glass. What do you do to maintain the sand?
So the sand, because of the fact that we don't have bare bottom here, collects the same amount of detritus. It just presents itself differently. So we do gravel vac it, and we try to do that weekly. And then maybe once a month we'll go in with a net and we'll actually sift the bigger particles out of the sand that accumulate.
So the reoccurring theme here is everything's the same, everything's simple. As far as like pump maintenance, are we talking about the same as on the 500?
Yeah, so anytime we're going to get algae on these pumps, we do pull them off and clean them because it is easy. You know, with the Vortex pump, you just pull it off, throw it in vinegar, scrub it down, and put it back in the tank. As far as filter socks, just like the other systems on our workflow chart, we do that twice a week.
So one thing we didn't touch on in the other tanks is your guys' testing schedule. What does that look like?
All of our systems get tested weekly for calcium, magnesium, nitrate, phosphate, salinity. Salinity is more like daily. Like I said, we have to top off a lot of our systems manually, but alkalinity gets done twice a week, and Joe does a great job of that. He logs all of our water parameters for the week for us.
With the 293, is there anything different you would do?
Yeah, first we would probably add a Vortex in the back right-hand corner because it is a little bit lacking back there, being the fact that it is 39 inches from front to back. Because of the fact that the tank is 39 inches from front to back, it's really difficult to work underneath it. So we would probably raise the stand and maybe put end panels that remove, or a door or something for easier access.
All right, Josh, the last question I have for you, is there any big wins on this tank?
Specific to this tank, definitely would be having Casper around. He's kind of our mascot. Many times people walk in the door and say, "Where's Casper?" And it is a good conversation piece.
So one last time I want to thank Josh for showing us around and giving us the details of this 293 tank. Thanks, Josh.
Thanks, Randy.
And just before we close this one out, we're going to go back through and show you the spectrum and intensities of the lights, and as well as take some PAR readings and other things to show you what's under the hood of this tank. All right, guys, we're wrapping up this final episode of the WWC tank interviews, and just like we did with the 900 and 500 gallon systems, I'm circling back to give you the in-depth specs for the light mounting and spacing, as well as PAR measurements that we took on this 293 gallon mixed reef tank. Looking first at the dimensions of this mixed tank, it's quite a bit shorter than the 9 and 500 gallon at 60 inches, 39 inches front to back, and 28 inches tall, and is lit with 2 rows of 3 for a total of 6 Radeon XR15s with diffusers. Right away, there are 2 takeaways that I see. First, with all 3 tanks, is their depth from front to back, which was 4 feet on the 900, 30 inches on the 500, and now 39 inches on the 293. Aesthetically, I'd have to say that I'm a big fan of these deep tanks and how they provide an eye-pleasing coral placement and aquascape, but also about the functionality that comes from having a lot of space from front to back to get water moving through all parts of the tank. The second thing that jumps out to me is that WWC didn't put a hood or canopy over this tank, which can make it more difficult to add T5s for that same even fill light as they did with the larger tanks, while still maintaining that clean look. But to compensate and still provide that spectrum blending and diffusion, they went with a diffuser on each Radeon XR15 and mounted them pretty high in a grid of 6 fixtures to essentially create the same effect, because a mixed reef tank doesn't need as much attention to that perfect blanket coverage as with an SPS dominant system. Let's take a look at these lights a little further, which, as I mentioned, are spaced in rows of 2, with each fixture being spaced right at 12 inches from inside edge to inside edge across the length of the tank, and the rows being spaced at 4 inches from the inside edge of one row to the other row. Again, much like Josh estimated for the other 2 tanks, where he figured these lights were mounted a bit higher from the water surface, when I measured the lights, they ended up being right at 13.5 inches from the surface, which is still higher than most reefers would at home, but a bit closer than the 500 and 900 gallon tanks. Yet on this mixed reef tank, the super even distribution of light is less critical. WWC has tripled down on the same lighting schedule for this tank, nearly exactly like the 500 and 900. However, here we see an an overall intensity set at 67% for both the morning and afternoon spectrum settings, keeping in mind that these are Radion XR15s and not the larger XR30s. So as we'll see in just a minute, it ends up producing slightly lower PAR overall, as could be expected and desired for a mixed reef tank. Just like the tanks we previously shared, there's a ramp-up time of about an hour, followed by 5 hours of a full or daylight spectrum from around 7 a.m. to noon, where the UV, blue, and violet channels are all set to 100, cool whites and greens at 50, and reds at 10%. After that, the spectrum shifts to remove the cool white, green, and reds, but all other channels stay the same from about noon to 7 p.m. for a full photo period of 12.5 hours. Now let's dive into the PAR numbers on this mixed reef tank, full of a diverse variety of corals, each with differing light requirements. The first thing I noticed when looking at the tank overall is that the majority of the higher PAR demand SPS are mounted in the upper to mid portions of the tank, where the PAR ranges from about 150 to the lower 200s on average. There are some places where the SPS are thriving in PAR down around the lower 100s, but I'd say the range is pretty similar to a lot of the same levels in the 9 and 500 gallon systems for these types of corals. Outside of that, for both the left and right sides of the tank, the overall PAR average throughout the tank during the first 5 hours of the more full daylight looking spectrum is only 128, which seems to hit a sweet spot for nearly all of the corals, including the LPS and softies. However, in some of those areas that dip below 100, you can see some strategically placed lower light corals thriving as well, which is a common method of coral placement in a mixed reef tank that WWC seems to have perfected pretty well. Moving on to the blue spectrum that runs for the last 7 hours of the day, we see a loss of only 31 PAR throughout the entire tank, which is right in line with the differences seen in the 500 and 900 gallon SPS dominant system. Here we can see that only a couple of points climb above the 150 PAR range, but the overall PAR stays under 100, coming in at an average of 97. This is likely a lower average PAR than many reefers maintain for their mixed reef tanks, but there's definitely no denying WWC's results. So what can we learn from the lighting recipe on this stunning mixed reef tank as opposed to the other two SPS dominant tanks at WWC? I'd say that catering to the lighting needs of a single or similar types of corals like the stick-heavy 900 and 500 gallon tanks may come with a few more challenges as far as providing an even amount of PAR from top to bottom and edge to the edge of the entire tank. Things like raising the lights up higher than normal to reduce shadowing and increase distribution, adding more lights than you may have thought you needed to overcome the same hurdles in even light spread and diffusion, or adding T5 bulbs to mitigate both challenges while maintaining that even fill light throughout the tank, which is critical for those SPS only or dominant tanks. However, here on the 293 mixed reef tank, I'd say that some of the same challenges exist, but seem to be a bit easier to overcome while maintaining an aesthetically appealing look and saving you a bit of cash in your pocket by using multiple single points of light mounted on a grid to more strategically provide that even distribution, then coupling that with the diffusers to replicate the fill light effect that the T5s bring, which can ultimately help to reduce shadows and blend the spectrum more evenly. I'm personally an advocate for this approach to lighting, as I'm not very keen on a canopy or hood myself, and these XR15s just look awesome over this tank. One last note to mention here, which I think Ryan will share his insight about in an upcoming episode, is the relationship we see between PAR and flow in the mixed reef tank, with both being intentionally lower, while the two larger SPS tanks have a PAR and flow relationship in the higher ranges. So that's it for the WWC tanks, and we can't thank them enough for letting us dive into these tanks, and for Josh giving up a couple of days to walk us through how he and his team create such amazing tanks that, honestly, a large amount of reefers dream about having in their own homes. Be sure to tune in next week when Ryan is back with his take on what he saw here and his introduction into how we plan to recreate the same gorgeous tanks that WWC has done here in our own lobby of the BRS office, using a hybrid system approach that pulls from WWC's recipe for creating an awesome tank, coupled with our own collective BRS knowledge and practices. We're doing this in hopes to provide you, the community, with an easy-to-understand path to ultimately do the same in your own home, regardless of what tank and equipment you choose to use. Don't forget that this entire month is the largest bulk reef supply giveaway we've ever done, with a Dream Tank outfitted with over $20,000 in gear, and next week we'll be showing you what it comes with. So be sure to hit that link in the lower left or head over to the site, click on free stuff at the top of the page, and get signed up. This is one giveaway you won't want to miss. See you next time on BRS TV.